What if I told you there was an NFL player who was essentially a mountain that moved like a freight train? A man so physically dominant that opposing linebackers didn't just fail to tackle him, they seemed to bounce off him as if he were made of reinforced steel. We often talk about generational talents, but this man was a century talent. From being so powerful that defenders legitimately feared for their safety to having a speed that made him look like a track star trapped in a fullback's body, Jim Brown was not just one of the greatest runners in NFL history, he was arguably the greatest athlete to ever step onto a professional field. His highlights are the stuff of legend, etched in the memories of those who filled Municipal Stadium in Cleveland or sat huddled around their TV sets in the late 50s and early 60s. But how did a multi-sport phenom, who many thought was too focused on lacrosse and basketball, become the most terrifying force in football history? And why did he walk away at the absolute zenith of his career, just after winning an MVP and while still holding every record that mattered? Why did he leave the Cleveland Browns when he was still the best player in the league? Well, to find out, we have to go back to St. Simons, Georgia, and later Manhasset, New York. Long before the Cleveland Browns ever realized they were about to draft a legend, it was here, growing up in a world that wasn't always welcoming to him, that Brown forged a resolve that was as unbreakable as his physical frame. Those early years installed a psychological fortress within Brown. It was a stoic drive that would define his entire NFL career, a rule that he would never let a defender know they had hurt him. Even after the most bone-jarring hits of the 1960s, you would see him slowly, almost painfully, climb back to his feet, walking back to the huddle with a deliberate pace that suggested he had all the time in the world. Now, before we get into the heavy hitting of Jim Brown's career, if you're a fan who remembers the grit of the old NFL, the days of the frozen tundra, the fearsome foursome, and the legendary battles of the 60s and 70s, you're in the right place. We love covering the real history of this game, the legends who built the league we watch today. If you want to see more deep dives into the icons of your era, feel free to join our community. From a young age, Brown was a freak of nature in every sport he touched. In high school at Manhasset, he earned 13 varsity letters. He averaged 38 points a game on the basketball court and was considered by many to be the greatest lacrosse player in the country. In fact, he's in the Hall of Fame for 3 different sports. But football was where the beast truly awoke. Despite his obvious talent, some recruiters worried he was too much of an individual or that his interests were too scattered. When he arrived at Syracuse University in 1953, the world wasn't ready for him. He was the only black player on the roster as a freshman, and his coaches were openly skeptical. They tried to bury him on the depth chart. They didn't think his upright running style would work against college defenses. They wanted him to crouch, to play smaller. But Jim Brown didn't know how to play small. The turning point came during his junior year in 1955. Syracuse was playing at Cornell, and after several injuries, Brown finally got the call. He didn't just play, he exploded. He rushed for 197 yards and 6 touchdowns. He also kicked 7 extra points. By the time his senior year rolled around in 1956, he was a consensus All-American. He capped off his college career by leading Syracuse to the Cotton Bowl against TCU. Though they lost a 28-27 heartbreaker, Brown accounted for 21 of Syracuse's 27 points. He finished 5th in the Heisman Trophy voting that year, a result that fans from the 50s still call the greatest snub in the history of the award. Paul Hornung won it that year on a 2-8 Notre Dame team, but everyone who watched the Cotton Bowl knew who the real best player in the country was. The NFL draft in 1957 featured names like Paul Hornung, John Arnett, and Len Dawson. The Cleveland Browns held the 6th overall pick. Paul Brown, the legendary coach and innovator, knew he needed a centerpiece. The Browns had dominated the early 50s with Otto Graham, but after Otto's retirement in 55, the team had slipped to a 5-7 record in 1956. They needed a new identity. They found it in the man who would wear 32. Entering Week 1 of 1957, the NFL was about to receive a massive wake-up call. The Browns opened against the New York Giants, who featured one of the most rugged defenses in the league. Most rookies take time to adjust to the speed of the pro game. Jim Brown didn't need a single second. He ran for 89 yards in his debut, but it was Week 9 against the Chicago Cardinals where the beast truly arrived. On a cold November afternoon at Cleveland Municipal Stadium, Brown didn't just run, he decimated. He set an NFL record with 237 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns in a single game. The rest of the league was in shock. This wasn't just a running back, it was a physical anomaly. He finished his rookie season with 942 yards, leading the league in rushing, a feat he would repeat in 8 of his 9 professional seasons. He was named the NFL MVP as a rookie, something that had never been done and has never been done since. He had restored the roar in Cleveland in just a matter of months. Statistics and records were things Jim Brown never seemed to chase, but they chased him. He didn't dance, he didn't juke just to show off. He ran with a terrifying efficiency. He would hit the line of scrimmage, and instead of looking for the hole, he would sometimes create the hole by sheer force of impact. By 1958, he was undoubtedly the most feared man in football. He followed up his rookie campaign by rushing for 1,527 yards in just 12 games. Think about that for a second. In an era where the ground and pound was the only way to play, and every defense knew exactly who was getting the ball, Brown still averaged over 5 yards per carry. Opposing coaches would spend all week designing Brown stoppers, defenses with 9 men in the box, and he would still run for 150 yards. In a 1958 game against the Chicago Cardinals, he went off for 180 yards and 4 touchdowns. The film from that game is like a horror movie for the Cardinals secondary. There's a specific play where 3 defenders have him wrapped up by the waist and legs, and he simply continues to walk downfield, dragging them like children for another 7 yards before the whistle blew. That was the essence of Jim Brown. He didn't just beat you, he demoralized you. The Browns were a perennial contender, but the early 60s were dominated by Vince Lombardi's Packers. Fans from that era remember the frustration of seeing Brown put up legendary numbers while the team struggled to get past the Giants or the Packers in the postseason. By 1963, however, Brown was reaching a level of play that defied logic. In a 14-game season, he rushed for 1,863 yards. If you adjust that to a modern 17-game schedule, he would have been over 2,200 yards. He averaged 6.4 yards per carry that year. It remains one of the greatest individual seasons any athlete has ever had in any sport. One of his most iconic runs of that stretch came against the Philadelphia Eagles. Brown took a simple toss to the right, was met by 3 Eagles at the line of scrimmage, stiff-armed one into the turf, lowered his shoulder through the second, and outpaced the third for a 70-yard touchdown. After the game, Eagles defenders were quoted as saying they felt like they had been in a car wreck. The pinnacle of his career came in 1964. The Browns finished 10-3-1 and earned a spot in the NFL championship game against the heavily favored Baltimore Colts, led by Johnny Unitas. The Colts were the darlings of the league, and most experts predicted a blowout in favor of Baltimore. But Jim Brown and the Cleveland defense had other plans. In front of nearly 80,000 screaming fans in Cleveland, the Browns played a perfect game. While the defense shut down Unitas, Brown was the engine of the offense. He rushed for 114 yards on 27 grueling carries, constantly moving the chains and wearing down the Colts front four. The Browns won 27-0, claiming their first title of the Jim Brown era. It would be the last major championship Cleveland would see for 52 years. However, the 1965 season, the year after the title, started to show the first signs of the friction that would eventually end his career. Brown was still the best in the league, rushing for 1,544 yards and 17 touchdowns, earning his 3rd MVP award. But off the field, he was becoming more involved in the burgeoning civil rights movement and was beginning to look toward a future in Hollywood. He had already filmed a small role in Rio Conchos and was being offered more substantial work. The Lions, the Packers, and the Giants all had their moments against him, but nobody could truly stop him. His final NFL game would turn out to be the 1965 NFL Championship against the Green Bay Packers on a field that was essentially a swamp of mud and melted snow at Lambeau. Brown was held to just 50 yards on 12 carries. The Packers won 23-12. At the time, no one realized this was the end. Fans expected him to return in 1966 to reclaim the throne, but then came the summer of 1966. Brown was in London filming The Dirty Dozen, playing the role of Robert Jefferson. Because of heavy rains in England, production fell behind schedule. Browns owner Art Modell, a man who didn't appreciate his star being more interested in movies than training camp, issued a public ultimatum. He threatened to fine Brown $1,500 for every week of camp he missed. To a man like Jim Brown, who valued his dignity and independence above all else, this was the ultimate insult. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. From his dressing room on the set of The Dirty Dozen, he sat down and wrote a letter to Modell. He announced his retirement from professional football at the age of 30. The world was stunned. First Jordan, then Gretzky, then Elway. But this was the first time a man walked away while he was still the undisputed king. He was one average season away from putting the rushing record into a stratosphere that would have taken 40 years to reach. He retired with 12,312 yards and 106 touchdowns. He had never missed a single game in his 9-year career due to injury. He never sat on the trainer's table. He never complained. He just left. Management had tried to bully him, and they lost their greatest asset.
I left at the age of 29 years old, and I was MVP of the league. I wanted to have a career, have it peak, and do other things.
The Browns would remain a good team for a few years with Leroy Kelly, but they were never the beast again. Brown was fed up with the power dynamics of the league and ready to pursue a life where he could use his voice for social change. He went on to become a major Hollywood star, but more importantly, he became a leader in the Black Economic Union and organized the famous Cleveland Summit in 1967, where he, Bill Russell, and a young Kareem Abdul-Jabbar supported Muhammad Ali's refusal to be drafted. It is truly amazing when you look at the longevity of his records. He left as the all-time leader in rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, and total touchdowns. It took Walter Payton, a man who played 13 seasons and carried the ball nearly 1,500 more times than Brown, to finally break the yardage record in 1984. When Jim Brown scored a touchdown, he didn't dance. He didn't spike the ball. He would simply hand the ball to the official and walk back to the sideline. He believed that acting like you'd been there before was the ultimate sign of dominance. He didn't care about the accolades or the notoriety. While he was playing, he cared about the physical reality of the game. And just like that, a season away from making his records completely untouchable, he retired. Only one more season of Jim Brown would have likely seen him cross the 14,000-yard mark in the mid-60s, a number that would have been unthinkable at the time. The 30-year-old today is remembered as the gold standard, according to many who played against him, including the greats of the 70s like Dick Butkus and Joe Green. Jim Brown wasn't just a player, he was a force of nature, a man who suddenly retired in his prime to preserve his health, his dignity, and his legacy.
This is Jim Brown, the most devastating ball carrier in the history of football.
For the fans who saw him run through the mud at Municipal Stadium, or those who remember the sheer panic in a commentator's voice when he broke into the open field, Jim Brown remains the greatest to ever do it. He was the NFL beast who didn't just run through defenses, he ran through the very fabric of the game itself. You can find out more about the legends of this era and the final games of other greats in this next video here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us keep the history of the game alive.